Hello, hello. This me. I'm back again, ready to do part two. This time, I'm thinking of chapters three through 5. I might get chapter 6 done, maybe. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 3: The Robot's Mission. Derek took the time for a meal, which he needed, and a shower, which he did not. But the shower provided him with something to do while thinking, and he had a lot to think about. His presence, his identity, the cause and reason for his memory impairment were as troublesome as ever. And after his excursion, he had a new mystery. Why were the robots behaving so strangely? Derek asked himself under what circumstances a robot might refuse to answer his questions, which amounted to refusing to obey his orders. Within his understanding of the law of robotics, Derek could think of only two, both illustrated by his experience with Darla, because it did not know the answers or because it had been instructed previously not to reveal them. Partisans did count for something with robots. A robot ordered by its owner to serve as a flyer would not leave that job to search for a neighbor's child's missing cat, unless it was the owner, not the child, who made the request. A carefully worded command would hold up against anything but a counter-order rooted in a first-law situation. If the robots had been told not to talk about anything they were doing, nothing Derek could do would make them disobey. Before he dressed, he searched his body for clues to who he was. He found no scars large enough that he would expect to remember when and how he acquired them. He bore no tattoos or skin ornaments, wore no rings or jewelry. The only distinctive mark he seemed to bear was inside, in the things that he knew. Somewhere, sometime, he had received advanced training in microelectronics. He had more than a passing understanding of robots and computers. Was that commonplace, a standard curriculum for someone his age? He thought not, and if not, it might be the trail that he could follow to rediscover himself. The comm center was continuing its transigence, still ignoring his input, still mockingly displaying the words "message transmitted." But there was one door that hadn't yet been slammed in his face. Donning a breather and a spare cartridge pack, Derek left the E-cell to explore the rest of the complex. Derek had begun by creating a mental map of the great chamber, assigning arbitrary compass points with the E-cell as his reference for south. The chamber seemed to be roughly rectangular, longer north to south than east to west by a factor of 2 or more. He started hand-walking northward down the same corridor the custodian robots had used, counting his paces as he went. 500 paces later, his arms were tired, and the north wall seemed no closer. Stopping to rest, he surveyed the robot population of the chamber. He tallied 17 of the humanoid robots, none of which were nearby. Among the non-humanoid robots, he identified 5 different types: the pickers, the custodians, the large cargo handler Derek dubbed a porter, some multi-armed micro-assemblers, and an armored robot with oversized grapples whose function he could not guess. Most of the robots he encountered were moving purposefully through the aisles, carrying out their assignments. But toward the north end of the chamber, Derek spotted a small army of robots standing inert and de-energized, waiting to be called into action. All the varieties were represented among the reserves except for the humanoid robots. The robot stockpile was Derek's clue to understanding where he was. The chamber seemed to be primarily a collection of spare parts. True, he had spotted a cluster of injection and extrusion machines in one area, a battery of laser wielders in another, a chip-burning shop in a third, all apparently in full-time use. But all those operations were apparently maintenance-related. Whatever they're doing here, they're on a very heavy-duty cycle. Possibly even continuous operations, he told himself. Zero downtime could be bought with a large-scale repair and maintenance operation, and that high price was only worth paying when time mattered more than money. There was a steady stream of robot traffic on the lifts located at intervals throughout this chamber. The obvious next step was to find out where they were going. Giving up his plan to walk the length of the chamber, Derek headed for the nearest lift. Like the Brever, the lifts were clearly the product of a unique approach to engineering. To Derek, they looked like something either unfinished or non-functional. There were also more proof that the complex had been designed with robots alone in mind. No human would have ridden one voluntarily. The shaft was a vertical boring 3 meters in diameter, its sides lined with the same synth mesh as the chamber ceiling. Peering out over the edge and down, Derek glimpsed a deep shaft lit at regular intervals by stationary blue glows, which he assumed marked other levels. The shaft seemed to extend much farther down than up, above the great chamber, which he had begun to think of as the warehouse. He counted only 7 levels, while below it he could see at least 20 levels before the traffic in the shaft obscured what might lie below. A descending lift platform on the nearest guide rod obliged Derek to duck back out of the way. The platform, a square grid a meter on the side, reached the floor level and stopped as though waiting for him. While it waited there, traffic kept moving on the other 3 guide rods. Watching the robots board and disembark, Derek thought that while the lift was in operation, the robots were clamped to the platforms ma- magnetically. He wondered how he would be able to keep his balance and footing without that assistance. There was no railings to grab onto, and the guide rod itself appeared to be electrically live. Personal considerations aside, he could not help but admire the engineering aesthetics of the lift. It was a clean and focused solution to the problem of moving the maximum amount of traffic in the minimum space and time, a solution fully integrated with the requirements of the colony. But as clever as the system was, Derek was not eager for a ride in the dark on an open platform above a seemingly bottomless pit. Still, it was that or go back to the E-cell. He swallowed hard once and stepped on carefully on to the waiting platform. Up, he said. Level, please? Level 2. Singing a high-pitched song, the car began to climb swiftly. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and his legs spread wide, keeping his vision focused upward toward the nearest of blue glows. He tried not to look at the shaft walls sliding swiftly by. The platform flashed through several other levels before gradually slowing to let him off. The glimpses he caught of them prepared him for what awaited him on 2. When he stepped off the lift, he was staring at a crossroads of 2 low-ceilinged tunnels, each 6 meters wide. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered with the ubiquitous off-white synth mesh. The air was colder than ever, cold enough to make him hunch his shoulders and bury his hands under his arms. Though the immediate vicinity of the lift was brightly lit by the blue floodlights, the tunnels themselves were illuminated only by dim yellow lamps set at intervals in the ceiling. Each was barely bright enough to mark its own position and make a tiny pool of yellow light on the floor of the tunnel. The distant ends of the intersecting tunnels were visible. The lines of ceiling lamps receded into infinity in both directions. The tunnel could be kilometers long, even tens of kilometers for all he could tell. Had they honeycombed this entire asteroid? Derek wondered. Thousands of levels, shaft 100 kilometers deep. Could this be a mining operation? But I could not understand why anyone would go to the trouble to mine an asteroid from the inside. The cutters on a prospecting ship could slice all but the densest iron nickel asteroids into bit-sized chunks for the leviation processing centers. No ore Derek knew of was worth the expense of tunnel and shaft mining on this scale. Even with the energy and raw materials economics which was applied with robot labor, it would have to be something 100 times more precious than the rarest element, unless the value of secrecy was part of the equation. Who am I dealing with? Derek wondered. Newly sombered, he stepped back onto the lift. Level 3, he said. The next two levels were just as silent and finished looking as two. Derek could not decide whether waiting they were finished waiting to be used, like the spare parts in the great chamber, or finished and abandoned. But level 5 was another story. The rumble of heavy machinery assaulted his ears even before the platform reached the lighted zone. When he stepped off the lift, he could feel rolling, low-frequency vibrations in the floor and ceiling of the tunnel. I'm getting closer, he thought. Now, which way? The sound surrounded him, offering no clue as to which of the tunnels had the most promise. While he stood there equivating, a double platform arrived and disgorged a robot porter. On impulse, Derek climbed into its half-full cargo pad. He was counting on its ignoring him, as the picker had. He was not disappointed. Neither cradling him in his arm, nor trying to dislodge him, the porter started down the south tunnel. For the first 2 minutes of the ride, wind noises and the whine of the robot's own mechanisms masked the distant work noise. But before long, Derek could sort out the separate elements. Irregular thumping sounds like muffled explosions, a high-pitched grinding that made his skin crawl, and a steady background rumble that suggested great masses of rock and ice being moved about. Presently the end of the tunnel came in sight as a black patch in the distance. Shortly after, Derek began to detect a whiff of ammonia in the air. The moment he did, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. He had wondered from the start why the complex outside the E-cell was filled with nitrogen. The robots did not require it. Strictly speaking, robots did not require an atmosphere at all, and keeping the complex sealed and pressurized had to be more complicated than simply opening it to space. But maintaining a standard two-gas atmosphere in the proper proportions throughout the vast complex was even more complicated. Derek had concluded that the nitrogen atmosphere and "open" breathers were a compromise between the inconvenience of full pressure suits and the complexity of a dual-gas E-system. The nitrogen allowed humans to speak and hear normally and move about without safe suits, without the fire and explosion risk posed by free oxygen. But Derek had overlooked something important. The ice, which made up a large fraction of the asteroid's bulk, were not water, but compounds like methane and ammonia. The mining processes would inevitably release them as gases into the work area, where they might react with the high energies and circuits of the mining machinery, or with each other. I should have seen it sooner, he thought. Without an atmosphere comprised of somewhat relative inert gas, there'd be no way to dilute the unwelcome compounds or effectively flush them out. So of course, an atmosphere. Of course, nitrogen. The atmosphere accommodated for a human presence, but was not primarily for human convenience. The porter slowed as they neared the end of the tunnel, and Derek took that opportunity to jump off. Ahead of him were several robots, gathered near the end of the tunnel and the gateway to which he had presumed was the work chamber. Throughout the gateway he caught glimpses of a ragged rock wall, equipment booms, and an occasional flash of bright light. The gateway itself was an enormous box-like machine, which filled the tunnel flush to the walls, floor, and ceiling. The only path to the work chamber was a narrow walkway between columns of bright green chemical storage tanks. That was where he had to go. As Derek drew closer, he saw that the gateway was actually crawling slowly forward. Like some mechanical larvae, the gateway was burrowing through the asteroidal mass and leaving a finished tunnel in its wake. Everything, The raw materials of the walls, the covering of reinforced Seth mesh, even the overhead lamps, were being handled in one continuous operation. The gateway was a four-surface paving machine, but Derek's real interest was in the extraction beyond. He stepped up onto the gateway and threaded his way between the shoulder-high cylinders, aware as he did that one of the humanoid robots was following him. There was a strong draft through the walkway and from the tunnel to the chamber beyond. Even so, the odor of ammonia was almost strong enough to make him gag. At the forward end, the narrow walkway widened into a control cabin, where two humanoid robots sat behind a bank of transparent panels, looking out into the excavation chamber that surrounded the gateway on three sides. Derek stopped a few steps short of the ramp into the excavation and tried to sort out the functions of the equipment that filled it. The uncut face of the asteroidal material was some 30 meters away. A two-headed boom cutter was working it, one boom bearing rotatory grinders, the other microwave lasers. They moved back and forth like weaving cobras, and the ice and rock wall crumbled before them. The laser seemed to be doing most of the damage. Suddenly released from its icy glue, the loose rock slothed off the surface with a cracking sound. More resistant deposits were gorged off by the rotating teeth of the grinder. The gases boiling off the face were being sucked into the wide-mouthed exhaust vents that loomed over the workface. As he studied the work rig, a metallic hand touched his shoulder. "You may not enter the processing zone during operations," the robot said. The robot's edict stirred a flash of annoyance. "I will if I want to," Derek snapped back over his shoulder. The robot tightened its grip pointedly. "You may not enter the processing zone during operations," the robot repeated. "Untrained personnel are considered at risk." Shrugging off its touch, Derek turned his back on the robot and looked once more into the excavation. Like the gateway, the mining unit was slowly advancing toward an ever-receding rock face. The motion brought the jumble of loose rocks within reach of scuttling scooper arms, which funneled it up a ramp to an enormous hopper. A pair of high-sided conveyors carried the material away from the hopper, one to the left and one to the right. While on the conveyor passed through an N-ray station, an X-ray station, and a magnometer. From that point on, things got confusing. It was as though, after having gone to all the trouble to mine the asteroid, the robots had forgot to sort out the part of it they wanted to keep. Some of the tailings were diverted to a spur conveyor, run through a crusher, and then used as raw material for the 15-centimeter thick walls of the tunnel. To Derek's astonishment, the rest carried to the back wall of the work chamber, reunited with the captured methane and ammonia, and built up a wall of ice and rock again. The excavation never got any larger. But what about the tunnel? Derek wondered. They have to be taking something out. Closer study showed him otherwise. The empty volume of the other lengthening access tunnel meant only that the asteroidal material surrounding it was being replaced in a more compressed state than it was when mined. Nothing was being extracted, nothing was being carried away for later refinement or shipment. It just didn't make sense. The depletion alarm on Derek's first cartridge pack began to sound, and he transferred the delivery tube to the backup. He would have to leave sooner or risk dying of nitrogen poisoning before he could return to the E-cell, but it was hard to tear himself away from the incomprehensible sight of a dozen robots and a few $1 million worth of heavy equipment engaged in a task as senseless as trying to dig a hole in water. And how many excavations just like this were underway elsewhere in the complex? 10? 50? 500? Trying to understand, Derek focused his attention on the robots. 3 of the armored type patrolled the hopper, breaking up snags with their grapples. A fourth stood on a small platform under the booms of the cutter, shattering oversized rocks as they fell from the face of blast from its chest-mounted laser. Two humanoids stared at the N-ray stations, intently studying the scanning screen. Derek's guardian angel was still standing with arms reached behind him, and he turned and sought the robot's eyes. "What are you mining here?" he demanded. "What's the point of all this?" The robot said nothing, gazing back with its expressionless eyes. "Get out of the way," Derek said disgustedly, and the robot stepped aside into the control booth to let him pass. His annoyance spilled over into anger. Derek stalked down the narrow walkway and jumped down into the tunnel. It was then he realized his mistake. There were no porter robots there to carry him back to the lift. "I need a ride," Derek said sharply to the nearest humanoid robot. "Can you tell me when the next porter robot will be making a delivery?" "What is your need?" "I need a ride. There's not an approved allocation of resources." Derek did not even bother to argue. Turning away, he stalked away northward, his mind unsettled, churning with unconnected thoughts. He felt as though the answer to all his questions was already in his grasp, except he couldn't recognize it. How did it all add up? What was wrong with the picture? As he hand-walked along the tunnel, his thoughts kept carrying him back to the robots. There's something about the way they behaved, the way they worked together. Throughout the complex, all the routine, repetitive jobs were being done by the non-humanoid robots. The blue-skinned humanoid robots were supervisors, troubleshooters, technicians, repair specialists. But they could have just as easily done the repetitive jobs as well, even tending the front line in the excavation. Instead, there were half a dozen specialized varieties, porters and pickers and miners that didn't act like robots at all. Derek stopped short and turned to stare back down the tunnel toward the excavation. Of course! The picker and the custodians, the tenders and the porters weren't specialized robots working with the blue robots. They were tools being used by the blue robots. Their intelligence was limited, perhaps not even prosonic in nature. The real intelligence resided in the humanoid robots, which might well be more sophisticated than any Derek had previously known of. But why were they all here? Derek thought of all the levels, all the tunnels that had already been bored out, all the massive asteroids still waiting undisturbed. Could he have stumbled on an industrial test site? It might explain much, the secrecy, the distinctive stamp of the unknown designer, the unending but pointless excavation. Focus on the robots, Derek told himself. The tasks they're handling themselves are the ones they consider critical. In a flash of memory, he saw the two humanoid robots tending the scanning instruments on the conveyor line, and suddenly Derek knew. The realization staggered him, and there was no pushing the notion away once it had formed in his mind. The robots weren't mining the asteroid at all. They were shifting it. They were searching for something, something lost or buried or hidden, something so unique that it was worth any pride, any effort. What that something was, Derek could not imagine, and just at that moment, he was not sure that he ever wanted to find out. Chapter 4. You can't get away from here. You can't get there from here. It was a very long way back to the lift. How fast had the porter gone when carrying him to the excavation? 40 kilometers per hour? Then the shaft lay 10 kilometers away. 60? Then a 50-kilometer hike awaited him at 1,000 strides, 1,000 arm swings to a kilometer. Even in a gravity field this weak, that was asking a lot from his body. He did not turn back only because he was sure that the supervisors, as he had already begun to think of the humanoid robots, knew where he was and how much oxygen he had. At some point, the two changing variables would intersect at a value which said he was in danger, and they would send a porter to fetch him and whisk him back to the E-cell. Each time he saw a robot coming toward him or heard one closing on him from behind, he began to anticipate relief for his weary arms and legs. But each time the robot sped past without even slowing. He considered trying to stop a porter by blocking the tunnel, but the only porters that came by were burdened with a full load of chemical tanks or machine parts. There was no room for him. Because there was no choice, Derek pressed on. For a time he tried counting the yellow ceiling lamps to prove to himself that he was making progress, but his mind wandered and he lost count. There was a terrible sameness to the tunnel, with its unrelieved stretches of white. It seemed as though he were caught in limbo, trapped on a subterranean treadmill. As it turned out, he was not wrong in thinking that the supervisors were aware of him, but he was quite wrong about the form their help would take. He had sat down to rest, his back against the west wall, when a picker came racing behind and stopped half a meter away. From its cargo basket it plucked a pair of fresh cartridge packs, laying them at his feet. Before he could react, it backed up, pivoted, and raced away. The timing was so perfect that the pack Derek was using began to sound its depletion alarm just as the picker vanished from sight in the distance. "Consistent," he said crossly, addressing the absent supervisors as he swapped the depleted packs for the new ones. "You've done as little as possible to help me right from the start, and this really is the very least you could do." Hours later, he reached the E-cell with barely enough energy to fold down one of the bunks before he collapsed in it. He was asleep in minutes, his body claiming its rest. But his troubles pursued him even in his dreams, which were full of silent blue robots, moving through dark places ripe with the cold scent of danger. When he awoke, Derek began to think about escaping, for it was clear now that the most likely message for the supervisors to have sent was something on the order of, "We have an intruder, what shall we do with him?" And Derek did not like most of the possible answers to that question. He did not think the supervisor robots, independent as they were capable of killing him. The first law was too deeply rooted in the basic structure of a post-ironic brain. To remove it or tamper with it was to guarantee trouble, up to and including complete intellectual disintegration. But the recipient of the message was probably human, and therefore quite capable of using violence in service of his or her self-interest. And they would want to know how he discovered the installation, and what he had wanted there, and he would have nothing to tell them. Perhaps they would accept that at face value and help him return to wherever he had come from. But considering the circumstances, the stronger possibility was that they would insist on answers. Derek sensed that it would take a long time to convince them that he had none. Even so, afterward they would want to make sure that he could never tell anyone what he had stumbled on. No, he did not want to wait around for the supervisor's masters to arrive. The key to escaping was Darla. The pod's thrusters were almost certainly rated for a much stronger gravity field than the one the asteroid boasted. If so, then there should be more than enough fuel remaining to lift off the asteroid again and put some distance between it and himself. If only he could convince Darla of the wisdom of that act. But first he had to find her. Measuring from memory, Derek suspected that the pod was too large to have brought down to lift. The robots must have removed him from the pod somewhere on the surface, inside an entry dome, perhaps, and left the pod behind. So he began by riding the lift in search of places where he could have been brought into the asteroid. It turned out to be called Level 0. At the top of the lift shaft, a disc-like pressure door scissors out of the way to allow the platform to pass, and the lift carried Derek up into a high-ceiling circular room 100 meters across. There was a supervisor there as well, seated at a control station with its back to Derek. Though it gave no such sign, Derek was sure the robot was aware of his presence. Stepping off the lift, Derek began to wander among the idle machines. This must be some of the equipment that was used to survey the outer crust of the asteroid, he thought. The flying globes were probably scanning platforms, while the other machines could be used to dig up any promising sites. It seemed just as obvious to Derek that the surface survey was complete. It was not only the appearance of the machines that led to the conclusion. Searching the surface first made sense. Why even begin the underground excavation before you were sure that the object of your search wouldn't be turned up by a much faster and far less complicated aerial survey? But Derek was less interested in sorting out the remaining mysteries about this world than he was in finding Darla and saying goodbye to it. A quick catalogue of the chamber turned up, and no sign of the pod or of his safe suit. But he did find a rack with 3 pearl-white augmented work suits. They were too large to use in the lower levels, or to allow him to climb into the pod once he found it. But he could still use one for an excursion to the surface. Moving behind the nearest suit, Dick grabbed the crossbar and vaulted himself feet first through the access door in the back. As he settled in the saddle-like seat, he felt the feedback pads snugging up against his feet. He inserted his arms into the suit's arms, and the controls for the external manipulator came into his hands. A sloping display screen reflected the status of the suit's systems on the bubble-like canopy before him. "Close and pressurize," he said, and the access door began to swing shut. He tried raising his arms, and the suit stirred in smooth response. At last, a little power, he thought. But when he turned to head for the ramp, he found a supervisor barring his way. "The surface is a restricted area," the robot said. Derek heard the words through a speaker at his ear and halted his advance. Probably the augmented suit was more than a match for a supervisor, or would be in the hands of a skilled operator, but Derek did not want to fight. He only wanted answers. "Tell me where I can find the survival pod I came here in," Derek said. "I do not have authorization to leave the community." "That's what it is, isn't it, on the surface? That's where you hid it. What did you do, put my suit back in it after you took it off me?" Derek demanded. "I'm going out. If you don't want to be damaged, you better get out of the way." The robot did not move. "The survival pod is not on the surface," it said. Considering the way the supervisor has been treating him, that was a generous answer, but Derek wanted more. "Either I go looking on the surface, or you show me where the pod is. Those are the only choices." There was a brief pause before the robot responded. When the answer came, it was a welcome surprise. "I will show you the pod. Are we going outside or down below?" "Down." Derek still wanted to go to the surface. He had hopes of being able to use the stars and the sky to determine, at least in general terms, where the planetoid was located, what kind of star it was orbiting, and whether the planetoid was independent or part of an interplanetary system. But until he found the pod, none of that mattered, so Derek could afford to be a gracious victor. "Thank you," he said. "If you just wait a moment, I'll put the suit back." But Derek did not get to enjoy his victory for long. The supervisor took him back down to the warehouse level and led him through the maze toward the east wall. As they swung around the molding section and its high rack supply cache, the robot stopped short. "Here." But Derek could see no pod. All he could see was a large open area, with rows of assorted components neatly arrayed on the floor. "Where?" With a sweeping motion of his arm, the supervisor repeated, "Here." That was when Derek took a closer look at the hardware laid out before him and realized the truth. The pod was there, just as the supervisor had said, but was in 1,000 pieces, lying on the floor like a giant jigsaw puzzle. The robots had disassembled it down to its fundamental components. Derek could recognize a few curved plates that had been part of the hull, several thruster bells, and a few meters from where Derek stood, the lenses from the 7 green lamps on the command console. "No!" he cried out despairingly. "Why did you do it?" "It was necessary to determine the search objective was not concealed within the pod. And my safe suit? Did they tear that apart too?" In answer, the supervisor led Derek into the maze and showed him his suit, lying in several dozen pieces. The fabric had been separated from the binding rings. The environmental systems had been stripped out of the chest unit. Even the helmet had been disassembled. "I'm surprised you didn't tear me apart too," he said bitterly as he looked at it. "Please explain the reason for your surprise," the robot said. "It is impossible for a robot to harm a human. Have you not been informed of this fact?" "Never mind," Derek said with a sigh. "I was being sarcastic." "Sir? Humans don't always mean what they say. Haven't you been informed of that fact?" After a moment he added, "But you did search me, didn't you?" "Yes. While you were unconscious, you were subjugated to a full-body magnetic resonance scan," the robot replied. Derek almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "It figures," he said. "I suppose having you put the suit and pod back together is out of the question. Nothing may take priority over the primary directive. What about all those spare robots sitting up north doing nothing? You could activate a few of those." "The task would require not only assemblers, but the supervision of a systemist. All systemists are fully scheduled under the current duty cycle." "I guess that means no," Derek said. He looked across the expanse of parts that was once a spacecraft inside. "Do you have a name of some kind?" "I am Monitor 5. "Why are you talking to me, Monitor 5? "I perceive that you are stressed. While stressed, humans frequently derive benefit from communication." Derek snorted. "I guess that's one way to say it. Then tell me, Monitor 5, do your robots know what you're looking for?" "I may not reveal any information about my mission here. What about me? Are you allowed to tell me what you know about me? What do you wish to know?" "The event recorder on the What do you wish to The event recorder in the survival pod. Did they find it?" "I was not part of that work unit. I was Consult Analyst 3. The robot paused. "Yes. A data recorder was located. Did it tell you what ship I came from? How I got here? Anything?" The recorder had not been initialized. The recording disk was blank. Stunned, Derek looked down and away to hide his expression from the robot. His gaze fell on the pile of fabric from his suit, and he knelt down and began to sift through it. "There was a data strip on my suit." "Yes, it was a test strip. It contained no personal data." Letting the fabric fall from his hands back to the floor, Derek slowly stood. "A test strip?" "They are quite common. They are used in calibrating a data reader scanner." "But it said Derek." "Yes, the lead manufacturer of such reader is Derek Data Systems." Derek felt the strength go out of his legs. "Then you don't know who I am either." "No, we do not know who you are." "And the message you sent about me, what did it say?" "I did not send the message. One moment while I consult Analyst 17. The robot paused. "Analyst 17 believed that, due to your irrational behavior, you would continue to harm or endanger the primary objective unless continually supervised. Therefore, he sent a message requesting that you be rescued." "He made the decision on his own?" "Analyst 17 felt the threat was of sufficient magnitude to transcend the prohibition regarding communications." "Prohibition from who? Who's in charge here? And who did he send the message to?" "I may not reveal any information about your mission here. Yes." Grimacing, Derek closed his eyes and tried to shut out the world. "Are you ill?" Monitor 5 asked, concerned. "No," Derek said in an unsteady voice. "I'm just back to square one is all." Okay. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry that this is a day late. I didn't mean for it to be. We were just really busy yesterday, so yeah. Anyway, didn't get quite as much reading done as I wanted to, but that's okay. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and if I have the time, I'll record the next video tomorrow. Thanks. Bye!